When the Titan Protocol is initiated, the world as we know it will be transformed by a force of unimaginable power. Experience the epic scale of our latest sci-fi drama where humanity meets its greatest challenge. Click subscribe now and be there for the activation of the future.
Son set his fork down on the left side of his plate, handle pointing toward me, and I felt my stomach drop. That was our signal. We invented it when he was 11 years old. We'd been at a birthday party for one of my work colleagues. My son hated crowds, hated making excuses, hated being the kid who asked to leave early. So we made a deal. Whenever he needed out, nervous, sick, uncomfortable, didn't matter, he'd set his fork or spoon with the handle pointing at me. No words. Nobody else would notice. I'd find a reason within 10 minutes to wrap things up. He was 31 years old now, and he was using it at Christmas dinner. I looked at him across the table. His girlfriend, Isabel, was laughing at something my wife had said, leaning in close, touching my wife's arm like they'd known each other for years. My son was smiling too, but it was the smile he used when he was somewhere else entirely. I had seen that smile at his high school graduation when he was already thinking about the drive home. I'd seen it at his grandfather's funeral. I picked up my water glass and took a slow sip. He caught my eye, gave the smallest nod. I looked at the fork again, handle pointing at me. 20 years since he'd used it, and he remembered. Isabel had come into our lives the previous April. My son called me on a Tuesday evening, not a Sunday, which is when he usually called, and said he'd met someone. I remember being in the garage when the call came in, replacing a light fixture that had been flickering for 3 months. I turned the breaker off and sat on an overturned bucket and listened. She was a financial consultant, he told me. They met at a continuing education seminar for his company. She was smart, he said. Really smart. The kind of smart you notice from across the room. She'd grown up in Charleston, moved to Phoenix for work, had a younger sister she was close to. She liked hiking and hated coffee shops that played music too loud. He laughed when he said that last part. The way you laugh when someone else's quirk has already become your quirk too. I asked the usual father questions. How long had they been talking? Where had they gone on their first proper date? Did she know what she wanted? He said he thought she did. I asked if she made him happy. He was quiet for just a second, the good kind of quiet, the kind that means someone is actually checking in with themselves instead of just answering. And then he said yes. I told him I was glad. I meant it. My wife and I met Isabel for the first time in September at a dinner my son arranged at a restaurant in Scottsdale. Isabel was warm. Genuinely warm, not the kind that evaporates after the third glass of wine. She asked my wife about her pottery class without me or my son prompting her. She'd remembered it from something my son must have mentioned weeks earlier. She asked me about my 30 years as a high school history teacher, and when I started in on one of my usual compressed answers, the kind I gave when I sensed people were just being polite, she stopped me. No, actually, she said. Which era do you think people misunderstand the most? Nobody asks follow-up questions like that unless they're actually listening. My wife liked her immediately. I liked her too. I told my son afterward that she seemed like someone who knew herself. He said that was exactly what he'd thought. By October, they were spending most weekends together. By November, she'd started leaving things at his apartment. A phone charger, a jacket, a paperback with a bookmark halfway through. Normal things, good things. The kind of things that mean someone is building something. Then came Christmas. My son and Isabel drove up from Scottsdale on the 23rd. We live about 90 miles north, up near Prescott, in the house where my son grew up. My wife had spent 2 days getting the place ready. Not because she needed to impress anyone, but because she's the kind of person who expresses love through preparation. The guest room had fresh towels. There was a poinsettia on the kitchen table. She'd made my son's favorite pie. A brown sugar chess pie from a recipe her mother had written on a note card 40 years ago. They arrived around 4 in the afternoon. Isabel hugged my wife before she even had her coat off. She'd brought wine and a small potted cactus in a terracotta pot with a little hand-painted tag that said, "For your windowsill." My wife put it on the kitchen windowsill immediately, next to the herbs. Dinner that first night was easy. We ate leftover chicken tortilla soup and played cards until almost midnight. Isabel was competitive at cards in the best way. Totally unself-conscious about it, quick to notice when she'd miscounted, laughing loudly when she lost a hand she'd been sure of. My son sat next to her and watched her the way people watch something they're still not quite sure is real. Christmas Eve was when things started to shift. I noticed it after lunch. We'd eaten sandwiches on the back porch, even though it was 53 degrees out, because the sun was good and nobody wanted to go inside. My son had been quieter than usual since morning, but I'd attributed it to the way some people go internal around the holidays, holding things a little closer to their chest. I didn't push. But then Isabel started talking about a colleague of hers, someone she worked with at her firm. She mentioned him casually at first, a friend from work, and then more specifically. He'd been helping clients get into something she described as a private real estate fund. She used the phrase several times, private real estate fund. She said the returns had been remarkable. She said the colleague had brought in several of his own family members, and they'd all done extremely well. She said the minimum buy-in was $25,000, but that for the right investor, there was flexibility. She said it the way people say things when they've been saying them for a while. Smooth, practiced, not in a dishonest way necessarily. Some people just talk about money that way, fluently, without self-consciousness. But I felt something go still inside me. I looked at my son. He was watching the yard. My wife asked a few polite questions. Isabel answered them confidently. The fund was backed by properties in the Sun Belt. The colleague had a track record of 12 years. She'd seen the documentation herself. She said she wasn't pushing anything. She just thought it was worth knowing about, especially for people who'd worked hard and wanted their money to do more than sit in a savings account. That evening, I went to the kitchen to refill the water pitcher, and my son followed me. He didn't say anything right away. He opened the refrigerator and stood there looking into it like he'd lost something. I filled the pitcher and waited. She's been talking about this investment thing since October, he said. He was still looking at the refrigerator. At first I thought it was just shop talk. She works in finance, so I figured, this is what people in that world talk about. I set the pitcher down. Has she asked you to put money in? He closed the refrigerator and leaned against the counter. She hasn't asked directly. It's more like she brings it up. Different angles. She'll mention the colleague, or mention a client who got in early and did well, or she'll talk about how she wishes she'd had information like this when she was younger. He paused. She mentioned that I'd be good at it, that I think analytically, that the kind of person who succeeds with this fund is someone who doesn't let emotion drive decisions. That last sentence landed somewhere in my chest and sat there. How much of your savings are we talking about? I asked. He looked at me. She suggested 50,000 as a starting point. I kept my face even. Have you moved any of it? No. He said it quickly. No, I haven't. But she asked me last week whether I'd talked to my financial advisor about it. And when I said I hadn't gotten around to it yet, she said that the window for the current fund cycle closes in January. He rubbed the back of his neck. She said the colleague was only taking a few more investors, that people on the waiting list had been there for months. I know that script. 30 years of teaching history means you learn patterns, and that is one of the oldest patterns in the world. Artificial scarcity, closing windows, the suggestion that you are one of the special few being offered entry. It's been used to sell snake oil, war bonds, land grabs, and Ponzi schemes since before the ink dried on the Constitution. But I didn't say any of that yet. Because he hadn't asked me. How are you feeling about it? I said. He was quiet for a moment. I don't know. That's the honest answer. She's great, Dad. You've seen her. She's great, and she's not some stranger. We're serious. So I keep wondering if I'm being paranoid, if I'm just not sophisticated enough to understand how these things work. What does your gut say? He didn't answer that right away. He looked at the window above the sink. Outside, the yard was dark, and the Christmas lights my wife had strung along the back fence were blinking slowly, blue and white. My gut says something's off, he said finally, but I can't tell if that's real or if I'm just scared of something good. I nodded. That's worth paying attention to. The part that can't tell. We went back out to the living room. My wife was showing Isabel photos from a trip we'd taken to Acadia 3 summers ago. Isabel was leaning over the coffee table looking at them, asking questions. She had her hand resting lightly on my wife's shoulder. I watched my son sit down next to her, watched him smile. And I thought, This is complicated. This is genuinely, painfully complicated. Christmas morning was quiet. We opened gifts slowly, the way we always do. My wife insists on one at a time, everyone watching, no tearing through piles. Isabel had brought my son a pocket-sized copy of a wilderness survival guide because he'd mentioned once that he'd always wanted to do a backcountry hike but never felt prepared. She'd flagged several pages with small paper clips. He held it for a long time before he put it down. She gave my wife a hand cream from a small apothecary in Charleston. My grandmother swears by it, she said. She's 82 and her hands look 40. My wife laughed. She opened it right there and put some on. I kept watching. I was doing that thing I hate, where I second-guess my instincts because the surface of things is so pleasant, because Isabel laughed at the right moments and remembered small details and was genuinely kind to my wife and my son in ways that looked, by every visible measure, like love. But the surface and the truth are not always the same shape. Christmas dinner was the meal my wife had been planning for a week. Prime rib, roasted carrots with honey and thyme, mashed potatoes with too much butter, which is the only way I will eat them. We set the table with the good dishes, the ones we only bring out a few times a year. I lit the candles. My wife put on the old Nat King Cole record she plays every Christmas. We sat down, and 3 minutes into the meal, my son set his fork down on the left side of his plate, handle pointing toward me. I looked at it. He was cutting his prime rib. His face gave nothing away. I had 10 minutes. I made it 7. I mentioned that I'd been meaning to talk to my son about an issue with the irrigation system on the north side of the property. Genuinely, there was an issue. I hadn't been making it up and asked if he'd mind taking a look with me before the light went. My wife said the food would keep. Isabel said, of course, no hurry. My son and I walked out the back door and into the cold. We didn't go to the irrigation system. We walked to the far end of the yard, near the fence with the Christmas lights, and stood there. He pulled his jacket tighter. She asked me this morning, he said, while you and Mom were still asleep. She said the January window closes in 2 weeks. She said if I was going to do it, she needed to connect me with her colleague this week so they could get the paperwork started. Did she give you anything in writing? She showed me something on her phone. A prospectus, she called it. It looked official. Nice formatting, lots of numbers. Does it have a registered fund name? An SEC filing number? He looked at me. Real private funds, the legitimate ones. They're registered with the Securities and Exchange Commission, I said. Or they're exempt, but even exempt funds have to file a Form D. It's public record. You can look it up on the SEC's EDGAR database in about 30 seconds. I paused. Did the prospectus have any of that? He was quiet. I didn't see any registration numbers. I didn't know to look. Did it have the name of the fund clearly listed? He thought about it. It said something like Sunstone Capital Partners or Sunstone Capital Group, something like that. We'll look it up tonight. Together. He nodded slowly. Did she tell you what the returns were, specifically? She said investors had seen between 18 and 22% annually over the last 4 years. 18 to 22% annually. Consistent. Over 4 years. In a market that by any honest measure had been volatile enough to keep seasoned investors up at night. That's not impossible, I said carefully. But it's the kind of number that should make you ask a lot of questions before you write a single check. Like what? Like where, specifically, are the properties? What's the structure? Are you buying equity or lending? What's the exit strategy if you need the money back before the fund matures? Who are the other investors, and can you contact any of them independently, not through her, not through the colleague, to verify their experience? I looked at him. And most importantly, why is the window closing in January? Real investment opportunities don't expire like grocery coupons. He stood there for a long moment. I kept telling myself she wouldn't do this, he said. That she's not that person. She might not know she's doing it, I said. That is. Sometimes people get recruited into these things genuinely. They believe in it. They've seen what looks like real returns. They pull in the people they care about because they think they're doing them a favor. I paused. That doesn't make it safe. What if the fund is real? What if I look it up and it checks out and I've just made her feel like I don't trust her? If it checks out, you tell her that, and you apologize for the extra scrutiny, and you move forward with your eyes open, That's not an insult. That's due diligence. I put my hand on his shoulder. If she's a person worth being with, she'll understand that a man who protects his money also knows how to protect his family. He looked at the Christmas lights for a while. I used the fork signal, he said. I know. I didn't know if you'd remember. Of course I remembered. He laughed, just barely, just enough, the kind of laugh that's mostly relief. I didn't want to ruin Christmas. I didn't want to say anything at the table and make it into a whole thing. You didn't ruin anything, I said. You did exactly what you were supposed to do. We went back inside. The prime rib was still warm. My wife had kept the oven on low, which she always does when she suspects someone might need a few extra minutes. Isabel looked up when we came in. Everything okay out there? Fine, I said. Just an old pipe issue. Nothing urgent. She nodded and smiled and passed my son the mashed potatoes. That night, after Isabel had gone to bed, my son and I sat at the kitchen table with his laptop. We looked up Sunstone Capital Partners on the SEC's EDGAR database. There was a filing 1, a Form D, filed 2 years earlier, for a fund of that name out of a registered address in Nevada. The filing was for a total offering of $400,000. $400,000 is not a fund that promises 22% annual returns to dozens of investors. My son stared at the screen for a long time. Then he looked up the colleague's name. First name only, the way Isabel had always referred to him, combined with the fund name in Phoenix. We found a complaint filed with the Arizona Department of Financial Institutions, then another from someone in Tucson, both filed within the last 18 months, both describing the same structure, a private real estate fund with impressive projected returns, a closing window, and a request to connect new investors directly to the fund manager, bypassing any outside verification. He closed the laptop slowly. What do I do, he asked. You talk to her, I said. You tell her what you found. You watch how she responds. And if she gets defensive, that's information too. He nodded, looked at the closed laptop. What if she didn't know? What if she's caught up in this the same way she was trying to catch me up in it? Then she needs to know too, I said. And you help her get out. And if she knew? I didn't answer that. Because he already knew the answer. I could see it in the way he asked, not looking for information, looking for permission to trust what you'd already figured out. You've always had good instincts, I said. You used the fork signal before you had the words for what was wrong. That matters. He was quiet. Then, I learned it from you. You always said, if something feels off, it usually is. You don't need to prove it to yourself first. I thought about how many times I'd told him that. At the breakfast table when he was 12, nervous about a friend who'd started pulling away from him in ways he couldn't name. In the car when he was 17, second-guessing whether a job offer was too good. On the phone when he was 25, asking whether the apartment deal his roommate proposed made sense. If something feels off, it usually is. You don't need a spreadsheet to trust your gut. He talked to Isabel the next morning before breakfast. I don't know exactly what was said. That was between them, as it should have been. My wife and I stayed in the kitchen and drank coffee and didn't ask questions. They were in the living room for almost an hour. When they came back into the kitchen, Isabel's eyes were red. She sat down at the table and wrapped both hands around a mug of coffee. She said she hadn't known about the complaints. She said her colleague had been a friend for 6 years, and she believed in the fund because she'd watched him believe in it. And now she didn't know what to believe. She looked at my son. I'm sorry, she said. I'm so sorry I pushed you on this. He put his hand over hers on the table. My wife quietly refilled everyone's coffee. The colleague turned out to be at the center of a larger scheme that the Arizona Department of Financial Institutions was already investigating. Isabel cooperated with the investigation. She lost a friendship of 6 years. She also, it turned out, had put her own money into the fund. $15,000 she'd taken from her savings because she'd trusted someone who trusted her enough to make the lie feel like a gift. She and my son are still together. Things were hard for a while. Not because of what she'd done, but because of everything that came after. The way trust gets stress tested when something like that happens. The way you have to decide over and over whether the person in front of you is the sum of their mistakes or the sum of what they do next. He decided. I'm glad he did. Last month he called me on a Tuesday again, same as the first time he told me about her. He said they were talking about moving in together. He said she'd been seeing a financial advisor, a real one, and had started rebuilding her savings. He said she asked about me sometimes, said she wanted to come back up to Prescott in the spring. I told him the guest room would be ready. He laughed. Then he got quiet in that good way again. "Dad," he said, "the fork thing. I've been thinking about it. Yeah, I want to keep it. I mean, I want us to keep having that. Some version of it. For the rest of our lives." I was quiet for a second. "You don't need a signal," I said. "You can just call me." "I know," he said. "But the signal means I don't have to explain first. It means you already know something's wrong before I have the words for it." I thought about that for a long time after we hung up. There is a version of being a father that's about answers, knowing things, having the right information at the right moment, and that matters. I won't pretend it doesn't. But there's another version, older, quieter, the version that's just about being present enough, long enough, that your kid can tell you something is wrong without having to say a single word. 20 years since he'd set that fork down, and when he needed it, he remembered. When I needed to see it, I was watching. That's the thing I'm most proud of. Not the EDGAR database search, not the questions I knew to ask. The fact that we'd built something, quietly, over 31 years, that could carry the weight of a Christmas dinner and a $50,000 decision and a girlfriend with red eyes and a 6-year friendship, turned to ash. It fit in the handle of a fork. It fit in the length of a yard in December, 2 people standing by a fence covered in blue and white lights, saying the things that needed to be said. That was enough. That has always been enough. I keep coming back to the moment my son closed that laptop. Not the database search. Not the complaints filed in Tucson and Phoenix. Just the quiet after. The way he sat there with both hands flat on the table, staring at the screen going dark, and didn't say anything for almost a full minute. That silence cost him something. You could see it. 6 months of believing in someone, of letting that belief reshape his daily life in small, incremental ways. What time he woke up, what he talked about at dinner, what kind of future he'd started quietly sketching in the back of his mind. And all of it had to be recalibrated in the space of a Tuesday night at the kitchen table. That's the part nobody talks about when they talk about scams. The financial loss is concrete, you can name it, file a report about it, work toward recovering it. But the recalibration, the work of figuring out what you actually knew versus what you only wanted to know, that takes longer. It's quieter. And it asks something of your character that a bank statement never will. What I saw in my son that week wasn't just intelligence. He did the right things, looked up the filing, asked the hard questions, followed the evidence where it led. But knowing how to find information is different from having the courage to act on it when the stakes are personal. Plenty of smart people see the warning signs and talk themselves out of trusting what they see because the cost of being right is too high. My son didn't do that. He sat with the discomfort of not knowing, used the fork signal instead of pretending everything was fine, and then, when the picture became clear, he did what needed to be done, even though it meant a hard conversation with someone he loved. That took something beyond intelligence. It took the willingness to be honest when honesty was expensive. And Isabel, I've thought about her too. She lost $15,000 and a 6-year friendship in the same week. She could have protected herself by getting defensive, by doubling down on what she'd believed, by deciding that admitting she'd been wrong was too humiliating to survive. She didn't. She sat at my kitchen table with red eyes and said, "I'm sorry to my son," before she said anything else. She cooperated with an investigation that embarrassed her. She started over slowly, in the way that people start over when they're being honest about why they ended up where they did. That kind of resilience doesn't announce itself. It doesn't look heroic from the outside. It looks like a person who got knocked sideways by something they trusted and chose, quietly, to rebuild anyway. Without bitterness, without shortcuts, one decision at a time. What the 3 of us stumbled toward, in that house over Christmas, was something I've spent 30 years trying to teach in a classroom and never quite managed to reduce to a lesson plan. The idea that good judgment isn't a talent you're born with. It's a practice. It's built out of small decisions, to pay attention, to ask the uncomfortable question, to not look away from what the evidence is telling you, to keep showing up for the people you love, even when the showing up is hard. My son set that fort down because we'd built something over 31 years that could carry the weight of an unspoken warning. That doesn't happen by accident. It happens because someone kept the door open, kept asking the real questions, kept being the kind of person worth trusting with the signal. I want to be that person. For whatever years I have left, that's the work.